Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today for this webinar with Jonathan. I am Sarah, who will be your moderator for today. I also have Melissa here, who's my colleague, who's going to help monitor the chat and the questions. And then we have Jonathan, who's remotely dialing in. He's based in Tennessee, and I just want to give you a little bit of background about Jonathan before we begin. Jonathan has many years of experience and completed over 30 projects related to SAP HANA technologies. Collectively, he has 15 years of BI and data management consulting with over 20 years of IT experience. Jonathan is also a well-known ecosystem contributor. You may recognize Jonathan as well as a speaker at various SAP conferences and as a contributor to SAP Press. His latest book is called Implementing SAP HANA. Please consider following Enowa and Jonathan on LinkedIn or his blog to get more information and stay up to date with the latest news on SAP BI tools and SAP HANA. Now that you know a little bit about our speaker, I want to give you a quick refresher and brief overview on Enowa. Enowa is a global SAP Gold partner, executing business process transformation projects supported by SAP products. In our 20 years in business, we have 100% repeat business with an incredibly strong track record. While we complete large-scale global and S4 transformation projects, we have other clients that prefer incremental pragmatic moves. And in today's webinar, we'll discuss one facet of a move, which is focused on analytics. It looks like most people have logged in, so we are ready to get started with a webinar. And as a reminder, for the best webinar experience, your audio is muted. We encourage everyone to submit your questions in the question area throughout the webinar, and this will help us get right into them at the end. And please note this webinar is being recorded. And with that, I am going to turn control over to Jonathan to get started. Jonathan, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Let me get my screen sharing set up and we can get started. All right. So let me give you a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today. This is becoming, and based on some of our own research that we've done, it looks like a lot of ECC clients will be making the journey over to S4 HANA in the next 5 years. And so I think this is a pretty hot topic. And, you know, I've been fortunate enough to work with Enowa, who's got a really strong reputation and successful implementations of S4 HANA. And it's given me the opportunity to be involved now in several different projects from an analytics and technology standpoint. So what I wanted to give you today is an overview of one of our recent experiences in moving a legacy ECC on HANA client over to S4 HANA. And this is a particular client that we've worked with for well over a decade. And so we had some experience with, you know, in the original days, helping them set up and create models in SAP HANA for their suite on HANA landscape. And now, of course, when they transitioned to S4, we helped them along that journey as well. But, you know, there was a lot of requirements that we had to facilitate. We had to get them from point A to point Z without actually taking down analytics for an extended amount of time. And so we came up with a strategy, and that's in large part what I'm going to share with you, how we actually navigated that, what is available with S4 to help you kind of get from point A to point Z there without disruption, and also tell you how, or show you at least some ways that SAP gives you kind of a playbook on how to build your HANA models. In the end, I'll give you an overview of our BI and analytics practice, show you and highlight some of our skills and capabilities in the SAP and non-SAP landscape when it comes to business intelligence and analytics, and then we'll open it up for questions as we have time. This is not a lot of content to go through, so we should have plenty of time in the end. I will try to show you a couple things in the SAP GUI. It's kind of a hands-on presentation that we use to help in that transition and the reverse engineering of some code that SAP puts out there. So without further ado, some of the key things that I want to discuss and objectives for the presentation today is, look at what are the functional and technical changes impacting existing ECC6 based HANA calculation views. And so, not every customer is going to have this scenario. A lot of customers are still using SAP BW. This customer has never used BW. They have used native HANA from the beginning. So there's no conversation or topic in this presentation about SAP BW. But at the same time, as well as navigating the back-end models, we also took this as an opportunity to move the customer off of their legacy business objects, dashboard visualizations, and exploration tools, and transition them over to SAP Analytics Cloud. So this is really two different things, I guess you would call innovations that this customer embarked on at the same time. We will discuss our migration path, give you kind of a high-level overview of how we did that without disrupting analytics. The client had business objects before, and we'll discuss why they continue to need business objects even after implementing SAP Analytics Cloud. And then in the end, some of the more technical pieces, I'll show you how we used CDS-based views that SAP delivers and compatibility views that they deliver with S4 to help us define calculation views within the S4 HANA landscape. There's some other tools that we used as well to kind of give us that cheat sheet there to do this without having to really be on an island by herself and trying to figure it out. SAP has got a ton of information out there, plus they're pretty open with their code, allowing you to kind of reverse engineer and figure out things. So a high-level overview on the client. We're not going to give out the client's name. We had decided not to do that for various reasons. They are a privately owned organization, multinational, so they have international expansions over the last decade. So I think that's important from a business intelligence standpoint, because we are having to deal with multiple currencies and multiple languages in our content that we develop. Main business focus is really flooring and textile industry, grease, lubricants, and specialty chemicals. They have 22 separate business units. Their background is really in textile and flooring, chemicals, and custom machinery and transportation. Over 500 employees globally, and the SAP mid-market company. So I gave you a brief overview or just an introduction there, that they have been on HANA for some time. Around 2013, I remember helping this client even all the way back then, 7 or 8 years ago. Enowa actually did the implementation of ECC6 on HANA. And at the time, they had asked myself and some other consultants to come in and help modernize their analytics. I think they were largely using reporting inside of ECC at the time, KE30 reports and some other custom-made reporting solutions in there, and a few other things. So they were pretty much stuck in that old SAP GUI of reporting. And so we came in back in 2013 and built. We really started with HANA Live. For those of you that may not remember, or maybe you do remember, SAP had delivered over almost 1,000 different calculation views that represented multidimensional modeling against SAP. They called it HANA Live. So we started with that because at the time that was what we were guided to by SAP. We'll talk about how we moved away from that over the years here in just a second. But they were also implemented business objects at the time. And so in addition to getting the HANA models, there was a rollout of web intelligence. And at the time, the dashboarding tool of choice was Excelsius. And we also had Explorer. And so if you remember, both Explorer and Excelsius are Flash-based. And of course, that presents a problem in the last year that we'll discuss. Because Flash really got removed from most operating systems. And in between that time, between you say 2013 and I guess it was probably around 2014 or 15, Design Studio came out. It was an HTML5 based dashboarding tool, and so we did actually build a couple of dashboards in Design Studio. But over the history of those years, I ended up with hundreds of HANA models, lots of web intelligence reports, a really key Excelsius dashboard that frankly never got replaced until just a few months ago by what we built in SAC. And of course, they had some Design Studio, and I think Explorer was a very, very popular tool there, a tool that I actually really liked. Just the downside to it, at least, was that it was Flash based, and we had to come up with a solution to get off of Flash. And so I've mentioned that over the years, the client moved away from HANA Live models. We did, even with this particular customer, had a relatively small footprint of data. I think their HANA database in total, from 2013 to 2020, never really exceeded 200 gigabytes. But even with that small amount of data, relatively speaking, the HANA Live models did not scale very well. We were getting query response times, up over a minute, and so that really triggered us to help optimize that. I won't get into our technique for optimizing that, but I will say at a high level, we basically just rewrote them and using a different methodology than what SAP did, and we improved the response times from minutes down to less than 5 seconds for almost every model. So that's kind of a methodology that I've developed over the years to help kind of get HANA models running fast and optimally for most customers. And I already mentioned I used a combination of business objects, web intelligence, dashboards, or Excelsius as it was called in the day, Explorer, and Design Studio. So let's talk about the journey, moving to S4. Now we'll start with, we were kind of presented with these two questions, I guess, from the very beginning. How do we cut over to S4 without impacting the existing reporting and analytics landscape? That was a good question, because if you've ever read the 1100-page simplification guide for S4 HANA 2020, you'll see that there's quite a few table changes. So things have moved from one table to another. Sometimes it's part in the original table, part in a new table. Have a lot of stuff that moves into MatDoc and ACDoc-A, and that's a lot to navigate, and it covers a lot of subject areas that get impacted and changed. So obviously the HANA models are based on tables, and so if those tables shift and move or change, then we have to redo the HANA models. And so, fortunately, SAP was not completely I hate to use that word. They did a really good job of making sure that not only HANA models, but really your ABAP code would kind of have a path forward for compatibility. And so I'll talk about how they did that internal to S4 HANA. But even with that, there are some things that there just is no alternative for, and you just have to rewrite the code for. You'll find this even with your ABAP programs when you move from ECC to S4. And the other key question is, okay, so obviously, we can't take analytics down for months so that we can get S4 implemented and then, start the clock and start rewriting everything afterwards. So we came up with a plan of what can we actually update before cutover, during cutover, and later after cutover in order to minimize disruption. And so that's really the key of what we're going to go through today, is kind of that strategy there. And hopefully you all can learn from this, and when you get to your S4 journey. Now, again, we're not talking SAP BW, so most of what I discuss here kind of gets hidden in the fact that S4 is delivered with new extractors that are already mapped to the right tables. So unless you have custom extractors with BW in your ECC system, you don't really have to think too much about this. But I still think it applies, because I have very few customers running BW that don't have some type of custom extractor in their landscape. So I think it's somewhat applicable, but in a very different methodology, to be honest. So the key thing to remember is when you go from ECC to S4, there are some radical table changes, and that can have an impact on extractors, which are ABAP based in the legacy, or now CDS based in the new S4 world in some cases, and it can also have an impact on really just anything you use to take data out of ECC. And so in this case, it would be SAP HANA models, or calculation views, as we call them. All right, so what are the challenges? So obviously, HANA Live is no longer supported on S4, meaning that SAP really didn't update HANA Live to work on S4. And so if you were still using HANA Live, or anything kind of based on the HANA Live model, like in this case, we had built some custom models, you do have to kind of transition those to the S4 table structures. Another thing that is kind of universal with S4 is that partner functions most likely need to be redesigned for S4. But the good news is if you're already on a more recent version of ECC, then you can actually do that partner function conversion pre-migration to S4. And of course, anything that we had code-wise on the HANA side and our HANA models could be updated pre-cutover as well. So that was a thing that we took advantage of, and partner functions were actually optimized and enhanced before we moved to S4. The other key thing, this is where I really praise SAP for the fact that they created so many compatibility views that really just represent the legacy tables in ECC. So compatibility views are catalog views in the database. They're not physical tables, but they look and act exactly like the old legacy table. They're just SQL code that remaps to the new table. And so that really helps, because a lot of our legacy models are pointed to legacy tables, which in S4 would be compatibility views. So that helps you kind of transition, I'd say probably 85–90% of your legacy code, whether it's HANA Live or some custom solution you base there off of it, can easily convert over, at least without disruption. Now, it may not be the best design from a performance standpoint, because you're building calculation views on top of catalog views, and there's a lot of code that goes in transforming all that may not get optimized very well on query execution time. But I'll say this: one, we didn't really see a huge drop in performance. It was probably 1 second at worst, slower queries, but that was also kind of covered up by the fact that from a hardware standpoint, the client went from I would say probably 7-year-old HANA database server to a modern HANA database server. So it was a way more powerful database in the first place. So it was pretty negligible. But nonetheless, after we actually made the transition to S4, we did actually re-optimize those same calculation views to use the new base tables and not the compatibility views. I already mentioned that the client had been on BusinessObjects, Dashboards, Excelsius, and Explorer, and had really not transitioned away from it even after Flash had been removed from the operating systems. We did find a Firefox-based browser. It's an open source browser out there where the Adobe Flash plugin would still work. And so they were able to use that browser. In fact, it still works even today. If we hadn't turned off or removed the content, they could have continued running that even today. So that gave them some extra time before we transitioned to SAC or moved them off of the HANA solution that they were on to continue using those dashboards and Explorer spaces. But it was kind of a ticking time bomb there. We didn't really have any confirmed end date for this particular open source browser to stop supporting Flash. And so that could have gone away at any time. So it was a little bit of risk on the client side to continue using that and waiting for the S4 transition before switching over to SAP Analytics Cloud content. But it did work out for them, and even to this day, that particular browser continues to work. And of course, the customer had started in 2013, so another challenge we had is they were still using analytic and attribute views for some models, which had kind of been replaced in later versions of HANA 1.0 and all versions of HANA 2.0. You really should be using the three different types of calculation view: the dimensional type, the star join type, and the traditional calc view, as an alternative to attribute and analytic views. In fact, that, you know, they would continue to run in the S4 environment on the compatibility views, but we did find a security issue post cutover that really forced us to update one model kind of unexpectedly. So analytic privileges, dynamic analytic privileges, did not work on one of the analytic views. Unfortunately, we didn't catch that in our testing, but you know, fair warning, if you're on analytic views and attribute views and moving to HANA 2.0 SPS 5, I would recommend that you get off of those before going to S4. So let me just give you some examples of some of the table changes that occurred in this ECC to S4. And this is by no means a complete list. It's just an example of some key tables. You can see that a lot of your costing and controlling tables, total tables for controllings, well, most of them exist as compatibility views, or they have some type of compatibility view for them in S4, but you know, technically they're all been moved into AC.A, which is the new universal journal. A lot of your accounting GL, like accounts payable, receivable, your GL balance tables, etc., all got moved into AC.A as well. Material ledger, all into AC.A. Asset accounting, all into AC.A. The only thing that may stick around is cost-based COPA, but account-based COPA is all in AC.A. And that's actually a key thing that I do find in my conversations with customers that they weren't aware of, is you don't have to actually switch to account-based COPA, although it's highly recommended that you do. Cost-based COPA will continue to run even in S4, which, you know, if for this client and a lot of our clients, they have a lot of reporting built off cost-based. So usually the decision is to continue running that for some time and then switch over to account-based, you know, when the time's right. In the future, some have actually chose to re-engineer their GL accounts to do account-based during migration as well. But you know, just a quick FYI, their cost-based COPA based on the CE1 tables, CE2 tables, CE3 and 4 tables continues to run even in S4 for clients. And from an analytics tool standpoint, here's kind of the transition that the client took. On the left is your kind of your legacy business objects tools. So they had dashboards or Excelsius, Design Studio, Explorer Spaces, which were all Flash-based, and Web Intelligence. And some of that content was converted. Well, all the dashboards and Explorer Spaces were converted into Analytics Cloud. Some Web Intelligence content was moved to SAP Analytics Cloud, but a lot of the Web Intelligence content actually stayed in business objects, and we would just move that over to their new models post cutover. And the primary reason for maintaining business objects, I think, is the same reason that a lot of clients do, is really from a report bursting and paginated report standpoint. I think Web Intelligence is still superior to most of the alternatives that you find in Analytics Cloud. The customer also had a very strict requirement that no data would be moved to Analytics Cloud. So we are using all live connections within Analytics Cloud. We do not upload any data whatsoever to Analytics Cloud. And so, you know, the good news is that you don't actually have to move your data to Analytics Cloud to continue using it from a dashboarding and Explorer standpoint. And, you know, if you are hesitant to move your data off premise and into the cloud, you know, SAP Analytics Cloud offers you the ability to actually legitimately keep it on premise. It doesn't even temporarily move it into Analytics Cloud when you're working in visualizations. All right, so how did we migrate without disrupting? This is kind of the bullet point overview. Again, I mentioned we did business partner upgrade in ECC6 prior to upgrading S4, and then of course we updated all impacted calculation views before cutover so that we didn't have to deal with that at cutover. We relied heavily on compatibility views in S4, which helped keep legacy HANA Live content or custom models that we created working post-migration for the most part. But the plan was, as soon as we cut over and everything, we got the green light for the S4 implementation, we quickly started redeveloping a lot of models, eliminating the HANA Live and compatibility view dependencies, or even the custom models that we had created over the time. Pre-cutover, we created new parallel models based on tables that had replacements in S4. For example, the KONV table was replaced by PRCD elements, and so we had to, before we cut over, we had to actually build some models and then transport that content in and then switch it over at cutover, or those particular areas would stop, showing data or new data. I think the table KONV actually still exists in the S4 environment. It's not actually dropped during the upgrade. So there is a simplification guide SAP offers that you can check for most tables to see whether or not they're doing that. There are a handful of tables that continue to exist, but will no longer be populated post cutover. So you have to be very mindful of those and switch over to the replacements. Again, we used the legacy Firefox browser. It was called Pale Moon, so that we could continue to run any Flash-based content pre and post cutover. And then, of course, we quickly transitioned to Analytics Cloud within, 3 or 4 weeks of that cutover. So I do get this question from time to time from other clients when I share with them this strategy. And if you're aware, there are CDS views in S4, Core Data Services views, that kind of replace what HANA Live was doing. But remember, this client had a ton of legacy content based on native HANA models, and CDS views are not the same as HANA models. And so the client didn't want to have to transition everything to CDS, because that would have required probably 3 to 4 times more effort than we had to use by maintaining the content. Plus, native HANA models work just as well as CDS views when it comes to SAP Analytics Cloud and Web Intelligence. So there really wasn't any technical challenges to continue using the native HANA models. And the client also had a lot of customization. And so even if SAP provided out-of-the-box CDS views, we probably have to make copies of a lot of them and modify them based on the client's customizations in their S4 or /ECC system over the years. And so, again, it was just, I would say it's the easier path for the customer to go from the HANA models that they had to the new HANA models. I would say probably 65 to 70% of the native HANA models they had were retained, and probably only 30 to 40% had to be recreated or updated. So, I mean, that's obviously a much better scenario than 100% of CDS view transition. So, all right, so this is kind of where I show you the cheat sheet that we used a little bit. I think most of the simplifications are outlined fairly well, although I have seen some issues in this guide. I have the link here, but I also have it open in the background. I'll show you here. So this is I think it ends up being 1,120 pages of how they made S4 simple. And really, it just kind of goes through every subject area, most of your tables, and you can search for KONV, which I brought that one up earlier. You can see here on page 781, it talks about how and why KONV was converted to the PCRD elements table. There's other tables that you can search for, like BSEG, MSEG, and a lot of things that had changes in them. So this was pretty key. I pretty much checked this guide for almost everything that we did, just to make sure we fully understood the technical changes that happen in the underlying tables. So this is a very, very, very handy guide to have when you're doing an ECC to S4 migration, and they do maintain it by version. So this is the 2020 version of S4. And so that's pretty important. You know, even if you move from one S4 version to the next, you probably have to consult this guide a little bit to make sure that you understand all the table changes and to see if any of your analytics were impacted. The other thing that you can do when it comes to compatibility views, and here's an example, and I'll show you briefly how you can use SE11 in the SAP GUI to kind of walk from what was FAGL FLEXT, which was a legacy ECC table, which is now a compatibility view in S4. And as you walk through that in SE11, you'll see that this is based on this view, which 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 is based on this view, and then finally you see AC.A. So that's a bit of a hierarchy to navigate, obviously, but you know, I guess you could say the blueprint is sitting right there for you to look at. So if you go into SE11, for example, and we type in this and hit display, you'll see the DDL for that particular view. And if you go up here to database objects under utilities and hit display, you can actually see the SQL code behind it for the create view, and you can see, well, it actually came from FAGL Flex T BCK and FGLV FLEG Flex T. I'm not going to go through each one of these for time's sake, but essentially you can just kind of walk back through each one of these and view the SQL code and see where in the from clause it comes from, a table or view wise. And eventually you'll get to AC.A. Now that's one way to do it, and that helps with the compatibility view. I actually find it somewhat easier to find a core data services view, like IGL account item here. And then there's a SDDLAR T code you can run in SAP. And then if you go to the base object explorer and hit analyze and then type in the CDS view name and hit the full tree, it'll kind of give you an outline of the different views that are involved in making up that particular, and you can kind of walk down, and as you get to each one of these views, you can double click on it and show the DDL code for it. In other words, the SQL code. I actually found this easier because I think the CDS views are a little better optimized and didn't rely on that hierarchy or daisy chain of compatibility views. So this was in the end a much easier shortcut for me to create similar models. One last thing, I did find a good blog post that kind of outlines a program that someone had created. Let me pull that up. And so I implemented this program, all the credit to this individual that created this. This was very handy, but it's a program, and if you scroll down, there's some code that you can go into SE38 and implement. And then once you get that program, which I think I called, ZCDS doc flow, as I called it. If you execute this program, you can put in a CDS view, and you can say everything that's above it and everything that's below it. So this is based directly off MatDoc, but if you ever wanted to see everything that's based on that CDS view, you can see this huge list of different object types. So this is a very, very helpful program too, because it showed both the parent and the child lineage of a CDS view, and helps you kind of locate a good CDS view to use for reverse engineering as you're moving over to S4. So back to the slides. All right, so I did want to be open and share some of our experience with Analytics Cloud versus, you know, legacy tools like Explorer, Dashboards, Excelsius, and Design Studio. So I guess one of the benefits of Analytics Cloud, although you can create more scripted-based dashboards, what we stated goal was to get the customer away from that Design Studio Excelsius paradigm, where it was always a bit of effort every time we needed to add anything to the dashboard, just because of the scripting coding languages those two tools used. Analytics Cloud was actually much more drag and drop, self-service, as you may call it. And so we tried to, as much as possible, any dashboard we redeveloped to just kind of keep it in that drag and drop, out of the box component mode, so that we didn't have to maintain custom components or custom code. And that was one of the stated goals, and I think we did achieve that. There was some functionality changed from the user's perspective on the dashboards. They didn't work exactly the same way, but I think the long-term cost of ownership is much better when you kind of stick to that out-of-the-box component, drag and drop, all graphical, less scripting mode. I would say compared to Dashboards Excelsius, Analytics Cloud is way more scalable and easier to develop with live connections. If you ever try to do live connections with Excelsius, it was a bit of effort. I didn't have to know Excel, and I didn't have to be a web services expert in order to get live connections. And of course, SAC has no dependency on Flash, so it's pretty agile and fast in most modern browsers. I will say that strong HANA modeling is required to use for live HANA connections. You pretty much have to model your data really well in order to make that work in a live HANA environment, a live HANA connection environment. We weren't uploading data, so we couldn't do any additional merging, joining, massaging of the data in Analytics Cloud. We had to make sure it came out of our HANA model exactly the way it needed to be for the dashboards to function. Number formatting has always been kind of an interesting part of any SAP BI tool over the last few years. They don't really give you direct override capability with number formatting, at least to the extent I'm used to in tools like Web Intelligence or even third-party tools. Although, the way that they do it is just different, is essentially you have to use the semantics of your HANA calculation view to drive number formatting. So like $signs, units of measure, etc., is all really based on the semantics and the currency code and the unit of measure in the SAP data. But I would say overall, just being able to go in and say, I want to format this as $, regardless of what the semantic type is in the model, that functionality is not there yet. But it's a rethinking of the way you approach that. You just have to push that kind of stuff into your HANA model and not rely on doing it in the front end tool. I think that the way the comments work in SAC stories is a little bit more limited to the way they worked in BusinessObjects. They're a little bit more cumbersome and not as apparent how to use. Fortunately, the client only did that on one dashboard, but it was a bit of a learning curve for most of the users to have to transition. And I would say overall, I thought, even though it was Flash-based, the BusinessObjects Explorer tool was slightly more self-service and easier to use than what's currently available in SAC-based Explorer views. I'd say the functionality is probably 90% the same, but there are some pretty significant differences, some for the better, but still something you have to deal with in change management, and some that I think could still use some improvement. But at the end of the day, you're getting almost the same functionality, but you're not Flash based. So, and it was, from a development standpoint, it's a little bit more difficult to set up Explorer. You kind of have to build a table and then switch over to Explorer mode, and then there's a lot to it that could be a little bit more streamlined, in my opinion, than SAC. I already mentioned how we use the CDS views as well. The CDS views you can open up in the GUI and look at the code, or you can open up in the ABAP tools in HANA Studio or Eclipse. In S4, SAP moved away from native HANA models, really HANA Live. standard and more towards core data services, which is kind of maintained at the ABAP server level. It is SQL-esque or like SQL, but it has some proprietary components to it. You know, like meta tags and associations and things that are still SQL in principle, but not ANSI 92 SQL like you'd write with most databases. But the key thing there is when you do create a CDS view in the ABAP layer, it does create a corresponding calculation view or catalog view, sorry, and table function on the table function in the HANA database. So if you ever need the raw SQL, which I think translates much easier to native HANA modeling, you can drop down to the database, or you can actually find that in the SAP GUI and look at the code behind that. And we use that pretty heavily in this project to help reverse engineer. And so that's really that last bullet point, is how we use that underlying database object of CDS or compatibility views in order to reverse engineer to help navigate and how to build the calculation views. And it was fairly straightforward. I mean, in fact, you could copy and paste the SQL over if you really wanted to and build the HDB views on HANA. Or, you know, you could reverse engineer and just build your calculation view with all drag and drop functionality if you wanted to. And in a couple of cases, we just copied over the catalog view to HANA and made that the base of our calculation view just for the sake of time. There was no performance drop in doing that, but of course it does require that you know SQL pretty well. So just a quick overview. That's kind of the conclusion of what I wanted to share on the project. Enowa does offer full service data and analytics, business intelligence, and data management practices. So from a business intelligence standpoint, you know, dealing with structured, you know, data that's needs to be well governed in order to provide on-demand access to KPIs and analytics. We support tools like BusinessObjects. We do support some third-party tools like Tableau and Power BI as well, which I'll show you on the next slide. Analytics Cloud, obviously, and BW. I think, you know, we're really good at dealing with hybrid scenarios too, where you've got a little mix of everything. From a data management standpoint, obviously we mentioned BW, but we also do data services, data mart, data warehousing. A lot of my resources have actually a lengthy multi-decade career in building data marts and data warehouses, and ETL tools like data services, Informatica, or just raw SQL and SSIS as well. But I think the key to all of this is the people, process, and technology being brought together. So data governance and the strategy and the architecture of building not only governed but agile central data warehouses, or logical data warehouses, I guess is the modern buzzword for that. If you do get into the big data and the data lake strategy and architecture, we can help with that as well. And of course, a lot of this is centered on HANA today. So, and anything HANA related, installations, upgrades, security. Actually, my team, for whatever reason, specializes in cloud deployments and actually HANA deployments in on-premise in the cloud, virtualization as well. And of course, all the S4 things like core data services, embedded analytics, and then your BW4 HANA, which is a later version of HANA, I'm sorry, BW, that a lot of clients are implementing. And then from, of course, our Microsoft capabilities are pretty extensive as well. We do all the Azure cloud services, information management like Data Factory, Azure databases, Synapse, data lakes, data warehouses, analytics like the data science, AI, and machine learning, using tools like Databricks. And then, of course, the front end Power BI platform, which is very popular amongst both SAP and non-SAP customers. We have a lot of expertise in that area as well. And I guess, you know, with having both SAP expertise, which is the core of what Enowa does, you know, we're really good at integrating Microsoft with SAP when it comes to analytics and data management. We do offer, if you're ever in need of help, we do have an assessment that we come in where we interview your folks, try to understand what they find most useful and what direction you want to take long term, whether that's self-service or heavily governed or some combination of both. We help with the people and process identification. I call them the well-governed data pipelines because I think that's something that everyone's interested in these days is, how do I do both self-service but have a single version of the truth and streamline on-demand access to the information throughout my organization. And quite frankly, there's no single technology solution that solves that. So I think a big part of our assessments is looking at the people and processes as well within your organization to help find ways to make better, faster, more on-demand data and analytics. And then of course the technology, which is a big piece of that as well. I think from a technology standpoint, my focus is largely on agility. Because I think a lot of the reasons self-service kind of went rogue is because technology, IT had spent a lot of time building out well-governed data sources, but then didn't make them very agile. So changes to them were very difficult. And so I kind of have a methodology and strategy to help from a technology standpoint, help work beyond that. And a lot of that is, of course, centered on HANA. You need the power of HANA in order to make things more agile, in my opinion. So I'll open it up to questions.
Hey, Jonathan, thank you so much for that presentation. We did have questions that came in, but for anyone who does need a drop off, you can send me your questions. My email is dropped in the chat by Melissa. And I'll go ahead and get started with the first question, which came in actually before your presentation. The question was, our organization uses multiple instances of SAP, one for North America and one for Europe. Can SAC support that in one SAC instance, or would we require a separate SAC instance per SAP?
Well, yes, it depends. Really, the question would have to be, my follow-up question to that would be, do you have to actually integrate the data together between the two? And if the answer to that is yes, I think you got to look first to get data into some type of central hub and then work together. And there's quite a bit of governance that goes into making sure things fit together like that. And while SAC has the ability to store data, I wouldn't call it a data warehouse by any means. So you'd be looking at doing some other type of either on-premise or cloud-based solution to move your data into a central hub first, get that together, and then of course, you could have a single instance of SAC for that. There will be some geographical concerns, I think, to some degree. Where does your data sit if you're doing live connections to some back-end data source geographically? So those are some things you'd have to work through and understand what the bandwidth requirements are there. But if you flip that around and there's no need whatsoever to integrate the data between the two SAP instances, then you could have it either way. You could have a single instance of SAC and create live connections to each system, or you could have multiple instances of SAC based really in the data center closer to that region, which again gets back to my performance question.
Thank you, Jonathan. And then we have a follow-up question by the same person that asked that question. For SAC, is the live data feed limited to S4 data sources, or are legacy SAP data sources also supported in the live feed?
So the live supports, I guess broadly speaking, there's more to it than this. You can do live connections to modern versions of SAP BW. You can do live connections to core data services built into S4. But you can also do live connections to HANA, and they all kind of work about the same. In fact, even a fourth one now, if you have BusinessObjects 4.3, you can do live connections to BusinessObjects universes and web intelligence reports. They all work through that INA HTTPS XML-based service, XMLA, a base service. And so if you're on legacy ECC, I think if you're on Suite on HANA, then of course you could build your HANA models and do the live connections there pretty easily. There is some CDS capabilities in later versions of NetWeaver as well, even if you're on Oracle or SQL Server, although that functionality is fairly limited. And and there aren't a lot of CDS views, so you may have to, build your own content there, and working kind of with that embedded BW, which is part of NetWeaver. But I think what most of my customers do choose in that scenario really is to get data into HANA, and there's several ways to do that. You could run Suite on HANA, obviously, which is mostly a technical upgrade of your ECC system to HANA without a lot of change to that. Or you can use the sidecar approach where you replicate the data from one instance to another. You also have the ability to use Data Warehouse Cloud, although that tool is kind of in its infancy. So I'm more of a wait and see approach yet with Data Warehouse Cloud. If you're not already on S4, if you're on S4, I think we can make that work. There's a lot of technical reasons for that I won't get into on this call, or this webinar, but overall, I think technologically there's a way to do it. I think it probably centers on HANA though, in most cases.
Next question is the reporting running directly on S4 tables and compatibility views, or is data being moved from S4 to native HANA via SLT?
Yeah, a lot of our clients will choose to use SLT in that scenario, and it'll work exactly the same as if it does on the database running S4. Now, this particular client I mentioned before, less than 200 gigs of data. They had a 1.5 terabytes of RAM on their HANA database. So plenty of headroom there. And there was really no concern, and all of our testing showed that there was no concern. So I think depending on the size of your database and the type of hardware you have running it, you can just run S4 and analytics on the same platform. In fact, I mean, that's the basis of CDS. I mean, if you're running CDS views, you're running them on the same database that runs your ECC or S4 system. So, but you can do it either way, and I have clients that do it either way. So it really just becomes a matter of scalability from a technology standpoint, or preference really from a, I don't want to take the risk of putting all my analytics queries on my HANA database that runs my ERP as well. But we do find a lot with our mid to smaller companies that they're able to do both on the same platform with really no risk. In fact, you can, on a per user basis, you can set statement memory limits anyway. So if you're really worried about it, we can cap everybody at 75 gigs of RAM at the most they'll ever be able to use. And that way we don't have any runaway queries that take down our ERP system.
And then Jonathan, this person asked for this client example, was it a brownfield migration, and how did you address trending year over year?
It was a brownfield, so we didn't lose any data or history whatsoever. There are many ways to approach S4, the greenfield, starting from new, or the selective data transfer, which may bring over some history, as well. But this particular customer was brownfield, so they basically did an in-place upgrade from ECC to S4 using all the SAP tools that convert the data into the new table structures.
Okay, we have a few more minutes for some more questions. Classic calculation view was deprecated by SAP, where the calculation view for the client based on XSA based calculation view. Sure.
Well, we went from, of course, attribute to analytic views in the XS Classic to calculation views in the XS Classic. We have not converted over to XS Advanced at all. We're still finding some issues with XS Advanced, at least on premise, even in the latest versions of HANA. The issues really stem from stability. Every time sometimes we do restarts and upgrades and XS Advanced stops working. And so we've had a lot of concerns with that. And it could be down for several days as we kind of work through with SAP to get it up and running again. So we haven't really transitioned to that. And then I had some major security concerns with XS Advanced with all of my clients. I won't get into that on this webinar, but there are some concerns with content and roles and things of that nature.
And then we have time for one more question. Was the client on enterprise SAP license to comply with data extraction, or did the client have a separate HANA instance for creating calculation view model?
HANA Enterprise. So a lot of it was required for this particular solution because they were actually doing some ETL. We have some SDI flow graphs in the environment that are doing some batch ETL from HANA to HANA, just to transform some of the more complex transformations and persist them for better memory optimization.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them over to me, and then we'll be sure to answer those for you. Thank you again.